continue with the contract, is the seller obligated to reveal that on a future contract or future listing?
Yeah, that question's come up a lot lately. It really would. There's two answers to this. The answer to any question of whether or not you should disclose, in my opinion, should always be yes. That being said, are they obligated to disclose it? That's going to be based on the level of the repairs. It's also going to be based on who's saying what. We have one right now as an example where the buyer's got an inspection. They read the inspection saying there was a ton of damage that needed to be repaired, and they got out, and now they're beating us up saying that we haven't changed the seller's disclosure. Well, the property disclosure. Well, first of all, it's not our call as the agent, just to be very, very clear. And so the seller has spoken to both the inspector that did the inspection, as well as an inspector that they know, as well as a contractor, all three of which have said, no, there are no issues here. It's, there's moisture there, but there's no evidence that it's causing any big problems. So no, to go change it is not necessary. But if, as the law writes, if it's a material fact, structural, or something that is addressed in the seller's disclosure that is now different, then yeah, they should go adjust the seller's disclosure. All right. So now I will say on that, just because this has happened a handful of times, be careful what battles you're trying to fight right now. And this isn't directed at you, Terry. There are a handful of people have asked this question. A lot of people are getting, up in arms about, well, we found this in the inspection and they're not disclosing it. And, again, I'm not saying it's a good thing that they're not, but I'm also saying choose your battles in this, because let's focus on your client now going and finding the house they do want, from that standpoint. All right. So as is, we finished that. Now we're going to go to due diligence. So due diligence is the second of the three options that they have. Due diligence period, basically, paragraph says basically that you have due diligence period that expires on this time and day and time right here that is marked at the bottom of page, I can't read what page it is, page 3. And during the due diligence period, here's what happens. The buyer has all inspections that they want to have done during the due diligence period. And then these 5 items will happen by the date up here. Okay, so by this date up here, one of these 5 items needs to have happened. Conduct an inspection, well, these need to happen. And then after that, deliver any repair requests or notice to the seller, which is on South Carolina Form 525. Proceed under the amended contract by either using 525 or under an as-is contract. If they agree not to do anything and the buyer's okay with it, and they go forward as is, or they terminate the contract by timely delivering notice of termination and the termination fee to the seller. Okay, this can be for any reason whatsoever. So if you're a listing agent, you need to explain to your client that you basically need to almost treat this as if you don't have you have a contract until this is done. Don't start packing or do any of this until we get through this. It is risky. Okay. Questions so far? Make sure I'm looking at the chat box.
Yeah, I got one, Joseph.
Yep.
On termination fee, how does that need to be, delivered, like physically delivered to that person in that due diligence period?
Yeah, so good question. So what we're going to do on this one is we're going to go through the forms on each one of them. So the first one's going to be, okay, how do we, how do I remove this is my next question. Can't get to my tab. There we go. So the first thing we're going to come back to Form 525 because this is the one you would use for the request. But technically what you would use is the notice of termination, which is this form, it's Form 313. So if you are the buyer and you're terminating this, you would actually terminate it by sending this, and then you would deliver the money with it. Now, what's happening most of the time is they're sending a notice of termination. And then in addition to that, they're dispersing the money from the earnest money, and they're sending their portion from the earnest money to the buyer, or excuse me, to the seller as their payment. Either one of those will work.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so the question that came in is, does the seller's response have to be within the due diligence timeframe? Yes. So if you're representing a seller, Okay, and let's go back to this. You're representing a seller. The buyer submits you a repair request, and let's just say the date on this is 6 p.m. on August, what's today? I don't even know what today is, 25th. Okay, if it's right now at 2 o'clock and you don't have that, then as the seller, you want to go ahead and have your notice of termination sent and ready to go. Because how this is written is if it is not submitted, if you have not done one of these 5 things or come through these 5 things here, if you don't obtain a new amended contract, you will be moving forward as is. Okay, so at 6 p.m. on the 15th, if you do not have an agreement by using 525 or by renegotiating the contract, or if you've not terminated, then you basically are moving forward as is with the property. Then the question is, can you extend the due diligence period with an amendment? The answer is yes. So you can do that. Now, what I would tell you, if I'm a seller, if I'm a listing agent, and your buyer's agent has waited up to the wire, I'd have 2 things prepared. I'd have an extension to send to them. And if you do not have the extension signed, at 5:45, I'd send a notice of termination. Because at 6:01, they're selling it as is. All right, so the question becomes the termination fee. What do I recommend? I have no idea because they're all over the place right now. I've had some people say that it's, I think a fair calculation would be whatever the time period is of the due diligence, what that would be a fair rental. So if you're looking what your carrying costs would be for the 15 days of the due diligence, that's probably what would be a fair thing to offer. If I'm the seller, that's what I'm going to counter at. So you know what, I'm fine going off the market for 2 weeks. However, I know my carrying costs between my mortgage payment and everything else is going to be X amount. And you can round that number. Most buyer's agents, a lot of buyer's agents are asking for 0, and a lot of listing agents are accepting it. I think, again, it's your job to ask your client, what best suits you on this one. Okay. All right, so due diligence. Now, let's say you get repair requests during due diligence. That's when you use Form 525. Now, Form 525 was originally designed for due diligence, but also will be used in repair procedure, but we'll get to that. All right, so here's Form 525. This is basically your repair addendum. It states in here that you're requesting repairs as the buyer. And by the way, it's saying in here that if you sign this and you have not agreed upon otherwise, you are going to have qualified repair workers, licensed, bonded, insured contractors, electricians, plumbers, roofers, builders. So if you're negotiating with your seller, don't blindly say, hey, yeah, sure, these are easy fixes for you to do, because this right here is going to tell you exactly who you need to hire. So make sure that you have that. What are the typical scenarios for using termination agreement or release a contract? Tara, I got your question, and we are going to cover that because that's going to be a blanket over all of them. So I don't want you to think I'm ignoring you. All right, so back to this. Basically, you're going to say, here are the repair. If I'm requesting repairs, here's the level at which they will be done. And then I'm going to attach inspection reports for references. You then will set up your time frame on here of when the repairs will be completed. Okay. This will also tell you when we can inspect and go back out and then have them, make sure the repairs are completed in time. So again, these are going to be fill in the blanks. Best practices for agreeing upon repairs are to write in the blank lines below the repairs and a specific reference to a specific repair recommendation in a specific attached document. All right, let's have a little chat. Okay. This does not mean attach the summary of the repair procedure or the inspection report that you have and say, see attached. If you do that, I mean this with the utmost love, that is lazy. Okay. You need to specifically, as it states in the contract, go back to it. Best practices to write in the blanks below, the repairs. with a reference to the repair recommendation in your inspection report. This will avoid vague repair requests. Okay. So again, I know a lot of inspection companies, they give you the option to click on the list of requested repairs and the verbiage is good in it. That's fine. I also think that it is not beneath any of us to spend the 10 minutes that it will take to move it to this document and specifically say, here are the repairs that we need. I'm not trying to be smug about it. I'm telling you, this is where the most vague conflicts come. And all of this is because we don't have a specific request made. Because the problem with a lot of the summary reports is they have recommendations. And the one that is most often said is what? What's the most often given recommendation in an inspection report?
Have a
Recommend
professional
further
look at it.
evaluation. What is that? That's your job as the buyer, right? That's your privilege to do during the due diligence and the repair procedures. So when you throw that in there, you run the risk of there being some vague requests and acceptances on there. Okay. All right. Let's jump back to Form 525. All right. So if seller fails to complete the repairs upon the repair agreement, the buyer shall accept the property, negotiate, or terminate this agreement by delivered notice and potentially seek legal remedies against the seller. This, Tara, make sure you make a little note to hold me accountable to make sure we cover this specifically. This line is one of the reasons that we have 3 different ways to terminate a contract. We have the release, we have the disbursement, and we have the notice of termination. Okay? You have to make sure that when you handle this in the right way, because if you want to seek legal remedies against the seller, you don't want to use the release. Okay? So, but what this is saying, to go back and clarify, if you're the buyer and the seller fails to complete the repairs agreed upon in this repair agreement, which includes these deadlines, I'm seeing a lot of listing agents right now that are not paying attention to this, and they're thinking it just needs to be done by closing. We just ran into this. It was not pretty. Okay? If it states the day in which it needs to be repaired and it's not, this contract allows that buyer to terminate if it's not done in time. It does not have to be done by closing. It has to be done per the written agreement. Okay? So just make sure that you understand that and you have the deadline. You make sure your contractors know, and if you think there's going to be any extension needed, that you address that accordingly. Make sense?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
No, you have
No, I was just going to ask, does the buyer lose their position if they don't terminate the contract within X amount of hours of that? It has to be done by this time.
It is not stipulated in there, no. So if to what Greg's question, and correct me if I'm summarizing it incorrectly, but what Greg's saying, if you in the repair procedure, we'll talk about that if the buyer doesn't do something within a certain period of time, then they can't do it again. It does not stipulate in the agreement. Here, I'll bring this back up. It does not stipulate in the repair addendum that if they don't do any of these, that they can't do them later. So just be careful now. It's a good question.
What is our position on it? When do I have to stop worrying that buyer is going to cancel the contract if my repairs are not done?
Technically, as it's written, if you're after the deadline, you can't stop worrying about it until they're completed. Now, if they get completed and they come back and say, hey, it wasn't completed by the date, therein lies a gray area to say, well, maybe, but you didn't actually exercise this notice of termination. So my opinion is if the repairs get done, even if they were after the deadline up here, if they are done, the buyer can't come and terminate at that point. That'd make for an interesting discussion, though.
Big discussion.
Yeah, I know some attorneys that would probably disagree with that. So bottom line is, get it done before, and if you need to, get an extension on these. You can always modify this extension. If your contractor comes back, if they're roof repairs and it's pouring down rain for a week, right? Your contractor can't get out there. They're exterior repairs. Roof repair is a bad example for the pouring down rain. You can always come back and you can modify these days that are in this part of the addendum.
Joseph,
Yes. Someone said my name. Go ahead.
What do you consider a repair that the owners can do? Like in that top paragraph, you know, it says you have to have an electrician and a plumber, but do I need to have a plumber to tighten, you know, the drain on the sink? What qualifies and what doesn't?
It defaults to having a plumber. So the only way that's going to be different is if you agree upon with amongst, you know, you can put in the, let me bring this back up. You can put in the blank here, when you list the repair, let's just say it's a loose toilet. You can put repair loose toilet dash to be done by John Smith on there. And that would agree to have someone else do it.
On the answer from the seller.
Correct. Yes.
Right.
Let's see. Let me go really quickly to the last question. Allison, what if your buyer wants cash instead of actual repairs done? You can use this. Now, you also want to make sure that the buyer checks with their lender on how they want that written. Because a lot of addendums, a lot of lenders, or some, I should say, lenders may not want an addendum that says cash in lieu of repairs, because then that may cause, you know, from a lending standpoint, they may then want the appraiser or someone to go out there and find out what these actual repairs are. So you could also just put in this one that says, you know, it doesn't have any repairs listed on here. It just said, you can use this one. It's probably better than an addendum, but you can use this one that says, all parties agree that seller will contribute $3,000 towards buyer's closing costs. The reason I like doing that on this form more so than a basic addendum, is for part 2 right here, which is this modification of contract. What this modification of contract does is it basically says you're no longer in due diligence, and this modifies the contract, and it replaces any agreed upon due diligence period under the repair section, which, by the way, does also include repair procedure, which we're about to get to.
Can I ask a question about that, Joseph?
Yes.
So if you are saying that this replaces, it ends the due diligence,
Yes.
if you have other things that you are looking for during this due diligence that are not just repairs, like let's say they wanted to rent it out and they wanted to make sure they could, or whatever those other things are, do you need to wait until you have finished figuring those things out before you send this in?
Yes. Because as this is written, when this is signed, what this says in section 2 is that this repair agreement replaces any agreed upon due diligence period under the repair section. So yes, you would, if you had other things that you were looking into other than the inspection and everything that you needed to cover before you got this agreed upon, you would want to wait.
Well, that's huge. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. See, it's good you're here. All right, we got up to 72 at one point. We're down to 69, so clearly I lost 3 people. All right. Any other questions about due diligence? Pretty cut and dry. Again, you're going to use Form 313 to send your official notice of termination. And then after that, you would do a release agreement if you were releasing the earnest money. The escrow agent is going to require either the release agreement, which is 518, or the disbursement agreement, which is 517. And I'll go through the difference between those after we get through repair procedure. All right, now's for the exciting time. Repair procedure. The contract that if I'm a betting man, or the part of the contract that if I'm a betting man, we're going to spend the next year or so of our lives explaining over and over and over again before they finally agree to remove it from the contract. But until then, it's a necessary evil. All right, repair procedure. Before we get into the specific verbiage of it, here's how you look at repair procedure. Repair procedure are pre-agreed upon repairs. Okay, so you want to make sure that when you're explaining this to your buyer, and I'm going to be talking to the buyer's agents on here first. When you explain to your buyer, you want to say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, 3 types of repairs that you can go. In the repair section, there's 3 ways we can go, as is due diligence and repair procedures. Repair procedure is all parties are agreeing ahead of time as to what the seller is going to be willing to repair. They're not required to repair. They're willing to repair. And if they do repair it, then you still move forward with the contract. Okay, Mr. Buyer, I want to be very clear on that. So if we do the repair procedure and the seller agrees to do all of the things that are anything that comes up under this, what's covered in this paragraph, then you still are bound by the contract to move forward with the purchase. Okay. So just want to make sure I explain that to you clearly, Mr. Buyer, so you understand that. Mr. Seller, we've gotten an offer. It's a repair procedure. Repair procedure from our standpoint is better because we know ahead of time what we need to fix. And that's covered here in paragraph 8, and we're going to go through these here in a second. Now, I want to be very clear. You and I are clear that this is what this means. I can't promise you that the buyer is clear on what this means. So it's saying that you'll only be obligated to cover these 9 things, but we might have a buyer that will ask for more. I'm just telling you that ahead of time. They're not trying to be tricky. They're not trying to do anything but ask. So I don't want you to get upset or emotional or anything when that happens. Is that okay? Okay, again, that's how you're going to explain this to both of the parties in there. Now, let's get into what this means. Paragraph 8, repair procedure. This has changed up a little bit. Basically, it says all repair procedure inspections and requests shall be completed and delivered to the seller by 6 p.m. on whatever date. I'm going to use the 15th again, just for example purposes today. I'm going to read this line by line because this is honestly, the more you know about this one, the more that you will start to understand it's actually fairly easy to interpret. It just uses about 4 times as many words as it needs to explain. Okay. Any and all requests necessary to place the heating systems, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, water supply systems, water waste systems to be conveyed in operative condition, to make the roof free of leaks, address environmental concerns, and to make improvements structurally sound, 9, should be delivered by the deadline above. Okay, that's pretty simple. Mr. Buyer, the only thing the seller will be obligated to address are these here. If we don't notify the seller by the date above, the buyer, you, shall have waived any and all rights under this term, which basically means you're moving forward as is. If your lender requires any additional inspections or certifications, these are to be provided by the buyer as well. Buyer at buyer's expense shall have the privilege and responsibility of inspecting the structure, square footage, environmental concerns, including but not limiting to mold, radon gas, lead-based hazards, including lead-based paints, wetland studies, the buildings, heating system, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, waterway systems, water supply systems, as well as the equipment, appurtenant equipment or appliances. So it basically says the same thing 3 times in that paragraph. Okay, and then you'll provide them, it's a requirement. It says will provide a copy of the inspection report if the seller requests. Okay, let's chat. Does anybody have any questions about what the repair procedure is saying is covered in the repair procedure part of the contract? All right.
Joseph, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Where it says that if the seller requests it, the buyer will provide the home inspection report. Can we send just that lovely summary most inspectors are doing now, or do we have to send the whole kit and caboodle?
As it's written, it's the report.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So let me ask you a question. I'm going to pick on you because you asked a question. Why is that a bad thing?
The whole report?
Yeah.
For me, my training is if we terminate, the seller now has a free inspection report to go make all those other repairs.
Okay.
But that's just how I was taught.
Valid. Yeah. I mean, I could see that. I'm glad I asked because that's, again, at the end of the day, it's up to your buyer to try to decipher those. But it is important that you explain that if they go repair procedure as the contract's written, if the seller asks, you have to send it.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of situations right now where the sellers are, refuse. I mean, they'll refuse if you're asking for a bunch of things and you're not sending the report. So I would just careful on that one. It's not required though. We just had this. It is not required in due diligence. There's nowhere in the due diligence process where it says you have to provide the inspection report. We just had one within the last couple days where they're demanding it, and the buyer didn't want to send it. I was like, there's no point. I don't need to get into the details as to why I'm terminating. I'm terminating, and I paid for the report. So it's a valid question.
Joseph?
Yes, sir.
With that same thought, going back to what Shenandoah said about if they terminate and you as the seller have received that full inspection report, are you not then, is it not incumbent on you then, or your seller to update the disclosures for any of those issues that are found in the inspection?
It is. So good question and good clarification. It's if any material facts that come up with that, now this goes into kind of a gray area of translating what should be disclosed and what's not. However, if there are any material facts that affect the property, both you and the seller are obligated to disclose it. You're actually obligated to disclose that if your seller doesn't.
How
Now,
do you do that?
And can I interject there?
yeah, go ahead. Greg, go ahead.
And here's where I don't disagree with you on that, Joseph. What I will say is there are people out there that will purposely bring in their own inspector to rip your house apart. So the facts that they're giving me are their facts, not mine. If you want to tell me it's a licensed HVAC guy, a licensed roofer, I will divulge those facts. Otherwise, it's a very subjective report coming from a buyer who is trying to negotiate a deal on a building. So I would say it's not a broad stroke to say, let it all in. If it's a licensed, because that home inspector, he's a licensed home inspector. He's not a licensed electrician, plumber, or roofer.
Yes. So absolutely. I completely agree with you. Again, same thing just happened. We had they were hell bent on the fact that we needed to be disclosing everything. And the seller had a contractor and another inspector and the first inspector who all said, no, that does not need to be disclosed. There's no problem there. So Stella, to your question, when in doubt, call me. And then secondly, if it's about the AC or it's about the roof or it's about things that, again, are not leaking, not, material facts or material damage, no, you don't then have the obligation to upload your report. Now, if you have some foundational issues and you have things that come up that are specifically mentioned on the property disclosure, or if they fall into one of the 9 of the repair procedure, I think at that point it would be good to explore whether or not you should disclose at that point. But no, I agree with Greg. It's not all of a sudden you're just having to upload it in the inspection report so the person can see what's going on.
Joseph,
Yes.
in your opinion, all this could be avoided if we did away with repair inspection and did due diligence. Do you think that'll ever happen?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we just basically looked at North Carolina and said, hey, that looked like the smart way to do it. We're just going to take 3 years to slowly pull the Band-Aid off.
The problem is in multiple offer situations, when sellers are looking at deals, they are looking at repair addendums automatically get precedence over due diligence a lot of times because they feel like, hey, we're locked in. Tell their sellers, hey, you're locked in because this is a repair. Due diligence, they can back out anytime. It freaks out the seller, of course.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult to compete against repair procedure for a seller. But if everybody had due diligence and they used a termination fee, I think it would level the playing field for everybody, but you'd have to get rid of repair inspection. Is that not correct or no?
I mean, you wouldn't have to. I mean, it would help level the playing field.
Yeah.
But that being said, you can also have a due diligence.
I'll win them,
Say that again?
I said I'm in multiple offers a lot these days, and that's a leg up is when you put the repair in there. versus a due diligence, you almost don't have a shot a lot of times.
Well, that depends on the money on your due diligence, though.
There you go.
Talking about the termination fee.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt about it. No
Yeah.
doubt about it. But I'm still a little bit hesitant because, you know, what I came from a buyer's agent team and they, you know, repair, lock them in. But I'm slowly trying to ease out of that because I wish everybody would just do due diligence. They get rid of that section. But
Right.
anyway, is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's I get it. Listen, this is a discussion Lynn and I have all the time, you know, from a buyer's agent standpoint. From a buyer standpoint, why would I do anything other than due diligence?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I want to know everything about the house. From a listing standpoint, my house is the best house in the world. So why would I do anything other than repair procedure? Let's see. Stella said, but you lose your money on the termination fee if you cancel the contract. Yes. Even if yes. So good clarification. Your termination fee in due diligence, it doesn't matter what the problem is. It's a termination fee. So you could go in and there can be foundational issues, mold issues, built on a nuclear plant, and you still have to pay a termination fee. So yeah, good clarification. All right. So let's go. Now we've gotten to where we've gotten the inspection done. The inspection comes back. We're going to send the repair requests to the seller by this date here. Now, it is the recommendation, and I follow it, that you use the repair addendum, Form 525, to give notice to the seller of any issues that have come up on the inspection report. A lot of people don't love that. And the reason they don't is because a lot of listing agents, they're super savvy and they like to say things like, hey, we're going to agree to repair whatever's required in paragraph 8 or the repair procedure. That's nice. And you seem like a nice guy. However, I want to make sure all parties agree to this. So use the repair addendum. SCR Forms Committee has looked at having a separate repair addendum for repair procedure, and they all realize that that's silly, right? So you're going to use the same form to request the repair procedure. Now, one big mistake that is often said or often used or made, I'll get to the English language at some point here, is when you use Form 525 that I can't get to because of there we go. When you use Form 525 under repair procedure, this paragraph does not apply. Okay, there's no expiration of the notice of giving and repair procedure that can be changed on here. The expiration of when you make this notice and when they respond is right here. Okay, so I don't want to confuse you, but a lot of times what happens is we're going to go back to the 15th. So we had for 6 p.m. by the 15th, you're going to send notice of anything that needs to be addressed out of the big 9. And then you're going to say no later than 6 p.m. on the 20th because you want to give enough time for the seller to do their research. Again, sellers not required to make these repairs. So you need to give them time to make sure that they are going to be able to do them. So if this says 6 p.m. on the 20th, then they have until 6 p.m. on the 20th to answer this. Here's what's happening. Buyer's agent, no judgment to them. Buyer's agent goes in. Really loving this whole format. Oh, come back. They fill this out as the request of the notice of repairs that are needed, and then they come down here and they say that it expires at 5 p.m. on August 17th. That doesn't matter. You as the listing agent can ignore it because you are already bound to this deadline right here that's in the second part of the repair procedure. Does that
So
make
the
sense?
main contract supersedes the repair addendum if you're using the repair procedure.
Correct.
Because you're saying this page and that page, and my computer's lagging, so I can't tell which one you're talking about.
Sorry. So yes. So it doesn't really supersede as much as that it's already agreed, right? You've already agreed that this is when the seller will reply. So an agent can't unilaterally come in or a buyer can't unilaterally come in and change the response date just because they put that in the expiration of offer. This happens a lot. This happens actually more often than I'd like to really acknowledge because it's I get it. They want to hear sooner. Your seller has until the date in Form 310 to respond.
So Joseph, I think the confusion for me with that is that I was always under the assumption that the belief that an addendum always superseded, it laid on top of the original contract. So you're saying in this one example, you know, it's even if we have a closing date on the original contract and we do an extension of the closing date, that addendum supersedes the contract.
Yes, the contents of the addendum, when ratified, supersedes the contract. All right. The difference between what Laura's saying is when I, as the buyer's agent, submit an addendum as a notice or request that has not been agreed upon by everyone. That's simply me notifying you of the request. So you haven't changed anything. Now, once the seller signs it, then yes, that would override the contract. But in this case, that wouldn't happen. The expiration date that's in that addendum is an expiration date for a request, but no one's agreed on it except for the buyer. Does that make sense?
Joseph?
I'm going to have Laura's silence is that makes sense. Yes, Greg, go ahead.
I think the confusion comes on the answering of the notice, because it is a notice that if you send back this notice that's coming at you with the request, if the buyer's side has put a date in there, you cross that out. If you are, am I right?
You can. It's a cleaner way to do it. You don't have to, though.
I think as soon as you leave it in there, you do become into a modification of the contract, though. Because
Right, but
both
if
parties
you
have
do,
signed.
if both parties have signed, then it's a moot point because then you've responded. So if both parties have signed,
But if there's an extension date in there, you've now just said, okay, we agree to that extension date.
which is fine because they've already, at that point, you've agreed upon it. So there's no reason to change the date at that point because you've come to an agreement.
I think you're missing. I'm not clearly stating. Anyway, okay, go. I'm good.
So the question is, why is the expiration section even included? Because the repair addendum is also used in due diligence. So in due diligence, you give an expiration because you need to hear back from them by a certain time so you can then decide whether or not you're going to move forward on the contract. Stella says, so basically if you sign the contract, so basically if you sign the repair addendum and it is a different date, then you're now set on the new date. Okay, so let me go back to that. This is the point that Greg's trying to make. If you sign the repair addendum, what we're talking about is not an extension, it's an expiration. So if you do sign the repair addendum, let's say the contract Form 310 says the seller had to respond by the 20th. And let's say Stella sends it to me and says that she wants me to respond by the 18th. Well, if I sign it before the 18th and we agree, it doesn't mean I agree on the 18th. It's a moot point because I've now responded per the contract before the deadline. So I don't need to change anything. Where this comes about is, let's say we hit to the 19th and Stella comes to me and says, hey, I needed to hear back from you by the 18th per the addendum I sent you, so we don't have to move forward. No, that's not true because I never agreed. Like, we already agreed on when I was going to respond to you.
That makes sense to me now, because it's basically just because you said it's due that day doesn't mean I agreed that it was due that day.
Correct. We already agreed what day it was due. Now, could it be argued if we signed it on the 19th and the expiration said the 18th, could that be a voidable contract? Probably not. It'd be a hard one to do on that one. Again, be less worried about, where did my screen go? On this one, just understand where the confusion lies is not whether or not we've extended it, is when buyer's agents that come in and say, hey, I know that the contract said the 20th, but I want to hear back on the 18th. You just can't change that. Okay. All right. So now we've submitted the repair procedure. Now the seller has until this date to deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make repairs on the buyer's request. The cost of all repairs, again, we're repeating of what repairs that they have to do, will be paid by the seller. Seller paid repairs. Okay? They do not include general home maintenance, fogged windows, grandfathered code issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, energy efficiency. If seller contractually agrees to make all requested seller paid repairs, the parties agree to proceed under the amended contract. The repairs to any other items are the sole responsibility of the buyer. Okay. Questions?
Joseph, I've got a question on that.
Yes, sir.
So they don't want to accept a due diligence, so we have to go repair. Can I submit my offer and knowing that, and I've done it before, knowing that one of the 9 items, that it's not one of the 9 items on repair. So let's just say damaged floors, something that's not on there. Can I submit my repair request with the offer? And then so that those items aren't on there, they're not accepting it, and then move forward.
So let me make sure I understand the question. So you're submitting an offer on the contract, or you're talking about when you submit the repair request?
I'm going to submit the repair request with the offer.
Got it.
With items, because they're not, if I accept the repair request, then I can only stick to the items that
This is a good one.
Right.
This is a good one. So, all right. So if I understand it correctly, the situation would be you're going to go in with repair procedure, but
Correct.
you know of a couple items through the walkthrough or whatever that aren't going to be covered in repair procedure. So you want to ask for those as well.
I submit that with my offer.
Okay. Yes, you can do that. However, if you do that on Form 525 and they agree to it, they at the same time are terminating the repair procedure. So if you did that, you would want to do it in an addendum, not a repair addendum.
Okay.
And let me just
And then
jump into why on that. So,
And then I can come back in before my repair inspection is up and submit the repair request, and then add in any of the 9 items.
correct. So what Drew's saying is, let's say you go in on a house and you walk through and you see the fog. Let's just use fogged windows. Okay. So you go through the fogged windows and you know that's not part of the repair procedure, but your buyers really want it. It's actually an interesting tactic. And if this comes up, please call me so we can walk through this. But so what Drew was asking is, would he submit an offer, check repair procedure, but then also submit a repair addendum with it, and in this repair addendum have fogged windows? He could. The problem is if the seller signed this and agreed to this form, as this form is written, it immediately will execute or exercise this part of the contract, and basically saying it's immediately modifying the contract, and there is no more due diligence. So if you wanted to do that, you would actually want to then put any repairs ahead of time on a plain addendum. And it would just say, seller agrees to replace fogged windows. So that way he'll go in, that's agreed on, that's completely separate from the repair procedure, and then you'll still go through the repair procedure from there forward, knowing they've already agreed to the windows. It's a good move, by the way. It's a good move. Who in here is ready for their mind to explode on that one? That was a good one, Drew.
Yeah,
What-
that one.
Yeah, what addendum would you use?
Just the regular addendum. I can't remember what form it is. It's like, I can't remember what number it is. It's in the 3s.
Hey, Joseph, to that, I want to add too, that's a good move if you've got a due diligence. If you're representing the buyer, you can add in section 28, and correct me if I'm wrong, contingent on buyer's complete satisfaction with results of the property inspection. And if that's in there, then it cancels out the due diligence period.
It cancels out repair procedure.
Right, and it's kind of open-ended, right?
Yeah, you're just suggesting that because that happened and you're pissed off at the buyer's
Yeah,
agent that did it.
yeah. We were talking about my guy earlier.
Yeah, he was a fun one. So what Drew was saying, and quite honestly, and Camille, I'll come back to you. So what Drew was saying is a buyer's agent can request repair procedure. This still happens, by the way, to old school buyer's agents that aren't paying attention to changes. is they'll do repair procedure, but then in section 28 of the contract, which is additional contingencies, and then you reference the forms, you can write in there, contract is contingent on buyer sole satisfaction of the home inspection, which essentially just made it due diligence. Which, by the way, that is exactly why they added due diligence, is because that's what savvy buyers agents were doing in the past and doing it. Oh, by the way, super important is why you read paragraph 28, because that can be very easily written in there and very easily missed. Camille, what was your question?
No, it was Form 310 is the addendum.
Form 310 is the contract. So it must be form
309, 311.
309.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so question from Cynthia. If your buyer, if as a buyer you've made your contract contingent on the clean seal 100, but you have done due diligence with a termination fee, do you still have to pay the termination fee no matter what, since you terminated even with the contingencies? So Cynthia, let me make sure I understand this. You went through due diligence and you've cleared due diligence. You came up with whatever your agreement, you've moved on from that. And now you've come up to the seal 100. Is that the question? Yes. Okay. So you can't, if the CO 100 is not clear, you can't terminate unless the buyer says they are not going to fix it. Okay. So the CO 100 is written just like the repair procedure is. If something comes up under the CO 100 and the seller's willing to fix it, you can't terminate the contract as the buyer. So from the buyer's side, when you come in and you realize that the CO 100 is not clear, again, if the seller says they're going to fix it, you can't terminate the contract without penalty. Now, if they say they are not going to fix it, then yes, you can terminate, and that's separate from due diligence. You would not have a termination fee. So Greg said, should the CO 100 be in the due diligence period from a listing agent's point of view? Oh, if it falls within the same, if it falls within 30 days of the contract, from due diligence, I would go ahead and just get it out of the way. From repair procedure, I see a lot of mistakes being made from buyer's agents on the CO 100 requests. But from I don't know, Greg, what do you think?
I think for pure due diligence, every inspection and everything should be done at the end of 15, 20, whatever time period you put on it, so that it gives the listing side of the seller the peace of mind that there's not one more thing down the road. And there's always one more thing down the road because it's financing.
Right.
But I think any kind of inspections need to be cut off at that point.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's probably a good practice to start doing. Just again, for peace of mind, and unless you've got some 60-day closing and you can't do it, get it all done. Now I'll come back to the how my feelings on that as far as it relates to the repair procedure. All right, let me see where the questions. This is the problem with that is if you're only, yeah, exactly. So as Stella said, if you have to have your CO 100 done within 30 days of the closing.
And I'll counter that as a listing agent. I'll counter that as a listing agent and say, you know what, if it doesn't come out clear, we all know it right up front. And if we need to do another one in 30 days, I'll be happy to pay for the.
There you go. Always thinking, Flanagan, always thinking. That's actually a good point, because that'd be worth the, some of them, even if it was $75 to go out again, that would probably be worth it. And they will knock it off because the agent, believe me, but I kind of see both sides. Can you explain why it isn't covered? All right, so Stella had one that said environmental issues. They had a buyer saying that pet odors were an environmental issue. And you said he was able to knock it off because the agent believed me, but I can see both sides. Can you explain why it isn't covered? No, I mean, it's hard to explain why it isn't covered, other than I would say it's probably open for discussion, but I would say that it would fall under more cosmetic, because I don't know that you could really say that there's going to be harm done unless there are allergies. I think this would be one that definitely would be a gray area worth discussing. If it came back and there were some pet odors that were causing allergies, I think as a buyer, you could argue that's an environmental concern. Which, by the way, is one of the handful of examples of why repair procedure, where is clear, agreed upon ahead of time, it's not always black and white. And to Greg's point, it says it's also clearly known probably before offers. Yes. And that's why you could say the same thing about fogged windows or, you know, a handful of other things. So there does tend to be a bit of a gray area. Okay, so to continue in this, if seller does not timely respond or does not agree to make all the seller paid repairs, and the buyer shall within 2 calendar days of this date up here, the buyer can choose one of the following: accept the property in its present condition, negotiate a new amended contract with the seller, which is going to be kind of hard to do because obviously if the seller hasn't responded, negotiations have kind of gone south, or terminate the contract by delivered notice, which would mean you send a notice of termination. If the buyer fails to accept, renegotiate, or terminate within these 2 calendar days up here, then the buyers agree to buy and the seller agrees to sell as is, which we've talked about what that means. All right. Our job is to identify those and address AKA Drew's add to the offer. Yeah, I do agree. This is why it is good when you're looking at a property. If there are things that are, you know, if you're coming in with a repair procedure and there are things that you've heard the buyer ask about, or you know something from a buyer's consultation that is incredibly important to the buyer, that you've had that discussion with them. All right, questions? Man, that was good. We're through repair procedure. All right, so Garrett says under repair procedure, it notes that landscaping isn't required. If the grass is overgrown by the time we close, did the seller have to have it cut? It's been argued that the sellers have to leave the property how it was when it went under contract. Yeah, it technically does say, this is a good call, Garrett. It technically does say in paragraph 2, or excuse me, 3, that they where is it? Seller agrees to maintain an operable condition in any personal property, including any landscaping, grounds, or other agreed upon repairs or replacements. Now, I think what this is saying in the repair procedure is that it is not landscaping issues that are out there. So if there's something with the landscaping, like they want to go in and say that the beds need to be redone or something like that, that would be what they're referring to there. They are required to maintain the lawn though. So your seller would in that situation be required to mow the lawn. All right, how does this relate to the earnest money? For example, if the seller refuses to repair one of the listed pre-agreed upon items, the buyer entitled to the earnest money automatically. All right, so yes, they are entitled to the earnest money. Automatically, no. Again, there's no automatic in earnest money. Earnest money has to be agreed upon by all parties. However, let's go back to this situation, Christine, and let's say we get to the section here where I'm sharing the wrong thing. Let's try this again. All right, so right here it says the seller does not timely respond or does not agree. Then the buyer at that point would send notice of termination. And per the contract, the buyer will be entitled to get the earnest money back. Nothing more though, because it was a risk they agreed to come about. So let's talk about what that looks like. There are 3 ways to terminate a contract, 2 of which involve the earnest money. The first way is a termination. It's form 313. So if I'm a buyer and time is of the essence and I'm in due diligence, or I'm within the 2 days right here, and I haven't heard from the seller, all I need to do is send this notice of termination, form 313. This notice of termination, receipt, acknowledgement, signature, time by recipient party is requested but not required for notice delivery. It's a very important phrase in here. This is notice. So if I send this as the buyer within all those timeframes or the due diligence timeframe, then I have performed on the contract and don't need to be held liable. Agents should detach themselves from the outcome of the earnest money. Only guide is the process too. Yes. Yes, by the way, that goes back to my golden rule. The goal is not to win the earnest money. However, you do want to protect your client if they're entitled to it. Okay, so that's the first way that you'll terminate a contract. This technically should be used in any of these situations in addition to what's going to happen with the earnest money. Okay, There are then two areas that involve the earnest money. The first one is the one that everyone's familiar with, which is the release of agreement. Now, a lot of times, most of you use this as your termination. Not the hill I'm going to die on as far as pushing for you to also have the Form 313. However, to cover yourself, this is an actual notice of termination. It states it in here. Yak, did I just stop sharing the screen again? Sorry. All right, are you guys seeing the notice of termination? Okay, thanks. This release of the agreement will work. It's not as clear. However, if you're a buyer and you send this release, that's pretty well argued that you're trying to terminate the contract. Okay, just understand that how it's all designed, the actual termination or notice of termination that is referred to in the contract is Form 313, not Form 518. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Again, this isn't something that I'm going to be super nitpicky on. So now you have Form 518. Form 518 is a complete release from the contract. Very important. It is a complete release that says, hold on, that they are releasing all parties from any claims, losses, costs, damages, etc. Okay, so let's say you have a situation where you're a listing agent and the buyer backs out at the very last minute and sends you this release and says, hey, we know we're defaulting on this, we're releasing this, and we're releasing the earnest money. If your seller signs this, they have no grounds to go back for any sort of further damages, time off the market, any repairs that they've done, or anything like that. So if your seller says, yeah, I want my earnest money and I possibly want to go after them for more, they should not sign this form here. They would go over here and sign Form 517, which is a disbursement agreement. This basically says that, yes, the earnest money is being dispersed to me. However, we are not releasing anything else. So we basically have any responsibilities, obligation, or rights for the contract are still in full force. So if you think that there is going to be a dispute further than the earnest money, or in addition to the earnest money, then you need to make sure that your seller or buyer, depending on the situation, signs the appropriate form. We just had this, and the seller signed the this full release. And then they were doing that under the assumption that they would then be able to still go, because they wanted the earnest money, because they wanted to get that, and they wanted to go after the buyer for damages. And by signing this, they're not able to do so, because they basically agreed to not go after them for damages. Now, here's the deal. In this market right now, just as a side note, again, I'm not one to roll over and let buyers just do whatever. You also want to choose your battles. I just had this conversation with our attorney, who is a real estate litigator, last week. And he said in the years he's been in the business, any seller pursuits to a buyer are 18 to 2 years out to get any resolution, and they never have ended in the buyer being forced to buy the house. So just keep that in mind. If you're a seller, when they're all amped up, ready to go and sue the world, just be careful on that. Lexi asked unilateral release. So there are a couple of parts in the contract that allow for a unilateral release, which is basically this notification that you would send. The first part in the contract is in paragraph 5, which is the earnest money. A seller can unilaterally release the contract if they do not receive the earnest money by the date above, which basically means they don't need an agreement to release it. Okay, by sending that, it's released the contract. It has not released the money, it's released the contract. The next part that's done is basically, most of them are done in any of the contingencies. The seller can do it during the financing contingency. If they haven't done it, they just have to send a terminate by contract by notice, which is right here. And then it's addressed in the repair procedure right down here by both buyer and seller, and then as well as in due diligence. All right, so got to think. What if the buyer wants to release and then go after the seller for damages for not holding up their end of the deal? They just signed 518 and nothing else. It would be no. If they wanted to go after them after, to Sarah's question, if the buyer wanted the release but then go after the seller, then they would sign Form 517 because that disperses it and it releases the contract, but it does not prevent them from going forward. Correct. Now, let me make sure I make a really, really clear point on this one. Any discussion of a buyer or a seller's ability to go after the other side for anything is legal advice. So if your buyer gets to the point where they're like, hey, we got screwed, we want to go after this guy, Sarah, what can we do? Well, Mr. Buyer, the first thing you can do is contact an attorney. So just yes, exactly. CYA, consult your attorney. And we have a good recommendation on good attorneys. And use this as an opportunity to take the high road on emotions, because part of your job could be to kind of help your client understand the true, especially for sellers right now. Sellers right now, I get it. Look, you don't want to be taken advantage of, but you also want to choose your battles. Getting your home back on the market and under contract within a week is probably going to be more advantageous in the long run than pursuing a buyer who didn't perform well on a contract. I'm not saying you can't. All right, other questions? All right, 1 hour and 12 minutes for one part of the contract.
This was fabulous, by the way.
Well, thanks. Look, here's the deal. You're going to get to it in your next situation. And you're going to forget everything we talked about, which is why I have an email on the phone, right? And I don't always have the answer. I will tell you though, 9 times out of 10, when you call with a contract question, I pick up the contract and I go read it. And I don't mean that in a way of like, go do the same. However, that is exactly how I solve probably 80 to 90% of these. And then I have a handful of attorneys and other brokers that I go bounce things off of. All right, any other questions? All right, go get contracts written and get in trouble. Come on, go mess some things up. All right, I'm kidding. All right, call me if you need anything. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.